Hello and welcome to the Tales from Wales podcast. Thank you for joining us. If anyone is watching at home, feel free to get involved. You can comment, and at the end of the show, perhaps we'll have some questions for our guest today, who is co-founder of Viz Comics and stand-up comedian Simon Donald. How are you, Simon?
I'm very well. How's yourself?
Not too bad. I think I'm holding up just about in this sort of strange sort of state we're currently living in, and not going too crazy in the process. So it's not too bad. How have you been holding up?
Smart haircut, I noticed there, Drew.
Yeah, done by the fair hand of my brother-in-law in the back garden. So you know,
right.
he had the clippers on the end of a rake, and he did it from 2 meters. So if anyone's going to question our social distancing process is there, and he looks like he did it with a rake as well. So that's all good, I think.
I got my special chap in. Yes, me.
How do you manage? How do you manage with the back then, though, Simon?
Basically, I use my beard trimmer, and I do it all over with the longest one.
Yeah.
And then, by means of the mountain range, I can feel the back of my head there. I just do it with the next shortest one up to the lumps where the bottom of your skull is there, and then I try to feather it a bit, and then I use the 2 mirror trick to see how well I've done, and then I use the even shorter one for just for around the edges there.
Yeah, to give it a little bit of contrast and a bit of style to it. It shows how much lockdown fatigue we've got when we're discussing our haircutting processes.
Exactly the same.
We've got the least interesting haircuts you could possibly imagine. But
use of the word style as well.
Yes, a stretch of the word style. But I think today we just want to sort of have a chat and mostly talk about you. As I said to anyone who is watching at home, if you've got any questions for Simon, pop them in the comment section. We might come round to them later. But I think, Simon, what you're sort of most well known for, and rightly so, is your involvement and sort of co-creation of Viz Comics at the tail end of the 70s in Newcastle. But with all our guests, I always do a little bit of Wikipedia research. Sometimes it backfires, sometimes it pays off. Sometimes it's some fake news is unearthed. But it said that you grew up in a Jesmond home in the 70s. Now, through my ignorance, I didn't know if Jesmond home was a type of structure or if it was the location of where you lived. But apparently Jesmond is a suburb of Newcastle upon Tyne. Could you paint a picture for us of Jesmond in the 70s?
Well, Jesmond's quite a leafy suburb, is how it's usually described. Basically, got loads of trees and that. But it's an interesting place. It's the largest suburb of Newcastle, and as such, it has quite a varied cross section of housing and people. With the part where we grew up was all purpose-built flats. Tyneside flats are a kind of Victorian Edwardian housing that appears to be a little terraced Victorian street of houses. But when you look, each property has 2 front doors that are right next to one another. And one door goes to the downstairs and one door goes to the upstairs, and they're separate entities, completely separate entities, purpose-built. Now, all of the streets where we lived were like that, except our street. Now, apparently, the landowner was a bit of a snob, and he didn't want people visiting the area to know that he was a developer of this sort of poorer working class type of housing. Yeah. So the one street that ran from the railway station down to the shopping street, which was where we lived, was houses.
Right.
So we basically, it was a pretty normal English red brick terraced house, 3-bed. Me and my brother Steve, Chris, who founded this, we were both born in the house. My eldest brother Steve was born in hospital, but it was in the 60s in Newcastle. Unless there was a serious illness or major problem, you were born at home. Yeah. So we were born in this street with a commuter railway station at the top of the street and a library at the bottom, a pub and a cinema at the top next to the railway station. It was all very normal, you know. It was very English sort of upbringing. It was very, very English suburban sort of lifestyle, you know.
Would you say, so like you said, that street was the nicer street? Is it almost like when you enter a hotel and the foyer is lovely and then the rooms are okay? Was that sort of approach, was it?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, Jesmond, to be fair, Jesmond was quite a nice neighbourhood. It very varied, as I say, because you did have these streets where the working class people of Jesmond lived in the terraced flats. But then just a few streets away, you had the giant mansions where the owners of the industries that had made Newcastle lived, you know. So you had the Armstrongs. Armstrong was Lord Armstrong, and he was behind the guns and hydraulic cranes, you know, all the heavy industry, and then later tanks. Yeah. And his place was just round the corner from here, because I still live I'm just on the borders of Jesmond now.
Yeah.
Although I have lived away, but you had these working class houses, and then you had the lower middle class houses, and then you had the middle class houses, and then you had these ridiculous places where the likes of Noble and Armstrong had lived, you know, these massive places, and everything in between, really. But then when we went to school, the thing with Jesmond is it's for those who know Newcastle, Jesmond is sort of known as one of the posher neighbourhoods.
Yeah.
And it has a number of private schools in it.
Okay.
But it doesn't have a public school. I say public, I mean in the sense owned by the public.
State school. Yeah.
State school, yeah. So in order to go to a state school, you had to go to Heaton.
Right.
And Heaton is another nice neighbourhood, but leaning more towards the working class and poorer neighbourhoods. You know, so you one across, and then beyond the school was the council estates of Heaton, and then beyond that was Walker. And the neighbourhoods, as you get closer towards the river and the shipyards, tended to get poorer and more working class. And so I went to school with all of the kids from those neighbourhoods. And also my father was from Shield Field, which is one of the rougher neighbourhoods of Newcastle. He grew up in poverty. And then he married my mum, who was from Jesmond, and she was kind of one of the lower middle class people from Jesmond. So I had this sort of strange upbringing of being half working class and half middle class, and sort of fell very heavily between two stools in a lot of situations, you know. So the kids didn't know how to bully you, you know. So we became the posh tramps. we lived in this posh neighborhood. We had free school meals and free school uniforms, you know.
Yeah. So does, like, obviously sort of your school, you started or sort of got involved with Viz when you were in your sort of late teens or your mid teens even, like your school experiences sort of feed into that at all? Because it's like, was it a case of taking doodling and a little bit further, you know, because in school there's often staying out the window and you're doodling in your book and not really paying attention to what's going on at the front of the class. How did that sort of feed into your sort of influences with Viz?
Well, that's pretty much exactly how it happened, Drew. My brother, Chris, is 4 years older than me. And he made friends with a pal called Jim. And Jim had been in Lancashire all his life. And then he come to our school in Heaton when he was 11. And he befriended Chris. And they were both a little bit quiet, reclusive, nerdy, you would say nowadays. And they had a coming together. That their sort of joint interest was initially railways. Bizarre enough, right? our street. I mentioned that the street where we were born, there was a railway station at the top of the street. We later moved a few streets down, to a street which directly overlooked the railway. So there was our houses made up one side of the street, and the other side of the street was a railing, and behind that railing was the commuter railway track. So as children, we grew up looking out of the window at trains passing.
Yeah. Yeah, so the first connection to the wider world, and when you're that age, the wider world is the next street, and then it's the next suburb, and then it's the town centre, you know. So your first experience of this more to the end of the street.
You know, we knew that these because on Sundays when they've always traditionally done the maintenance work on the rail tracks on Sundays, and on Sundays they used to divert all the mainline trains past us.
Yeah.
So it's very exciting because we knew that all of these trains were going to all of these places that we'd never heard of, you know. And so Jim, who he came from Lancashire, he was also based very close to the railway sidings in Heaton. And so they got talking, and Chris decided to start up a little magazine about railways.
Yeah.
Well, it was impossible to reproduce magazines as such, like we understand it now, because there was no photocopying. So in order to produce a magazine, you had to do it on a typewriter, and you had to use carbon paper in order to make copies. So he set up this magazine with a target audience of, it was called the Lily Crescent Locomotive Times, right? The target audience was the kids who lived in Lily Crescent, right? So this is a row of 26 houses that face the railway, right? So, and a lot of them had old retired couples in, right? So the number of children that he was aiming at was marginalized further by the fact that it was specifically the kids who lived in Lily Crescent who were interested in railways, right? His target audience was a total of 6 kids, and that included himself. Anyway, he made this little rag, that was just, just kids waffling about, what they'd seen on the railways today and things like that. But the other thing that he was doing in the classroom was he had these little, my dad was initially a milkman. He was a horse-drawn milkman, and his name was Ernie, and I haven't made that up. That's actually true, right? So, but then he got a job working for SO Blue Paraffin, SO Blue, right? And he used to have these little invoice pads, and he used to give us them to doodle on. Yeah. And my brother used to take them to school, and he created a character. His first comic character was called the Fat Crusader. So he was like a superhero, big fat superhero. And this superhero, sort of the first really in a long line of inept superheroes which we created for Viz. And what he did was, it was set amongst specifically the kids in his class. So all the kids in his class appeared in these stories. In fact, the Fat Crusader was the alter ego of this kid called Chris Scott Dixon, who was like the smallest, weediest kid in the class, and he became this superhero. And the superhero, basically, if you remember if you've ever seen the sort of low-budget horror films of the 70s where a load of teenagers go somewhere and then they're all dispatched one at a time, various methods by
your slasher genres, and
exactly. So it was that sort of style, So but they weren't reproduced. They were literally just these pages taken from these little invoice books with the drawings on, and then they were just passed around the classroom to the different kids in the class. And that was the first thing that Chris worked on. But Jim was also very keen on what we would now call alternative comedy. So surreal comedy. He introduced us to the idea of adult comics through the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers and Fat Freddy's Cat, which we didn't really like. It wasn't really our thing, but we'd never seen comics for grown-ups before, you know. So, and then he also introduced us to Derek and Clive, the Peter Cook and Dudley Moore thing. Now, we've been into Monty Python up to this time. We were one of the only families who watched Monty Python in its original late night slot. You know, we were, I guess, one of the more eccentric families. My parents didn't even know I was watching it. I used to hide. I had a place where I could hide in the sitting room at the end of the sofa, because my mum and dad had a sort of a routine, you know, where they would go through to the back kitchen, sort everything out for the next day, whilst I was supposed to have gone to bed. And what I would do whilst they were doing their stuff in the back, I would sneak down the stairs, sneak back into the sitting room where the telly was, and hide at the end of the sofa. There was this place at the end of the sofa where they couldn't sit. So they would come back into the room and I would be sitting there. But of course I had to remain entirely silent and watch one. And this worked for some time. And then for some reason, I sort of lost in the mists of time. My brother grasped me up, you know, and my parents, after that point, my parents always knew to check the end of the sofa, you know. So, but we've been watching Monty Python, and Jim introduced us to the comics for adults, the concept of Derek and Clive, which was the sort of free form adult humor thing, you know, to plumbing any depths of language and barriers. And
which at the time, of course, was very much pushing the envelope, isn't it? You know, I think there's a oversaturation or desensitization now to language and content that we are used to. But at the time, Derek and Clive was very sort of, maybe pioneering is the wrong word, but pushing that sort of level of content forward.
I think it's essential. When I sort of try to explain this to kids now, I realize now that it's essential to explain to them that there literally wasn't any swearing on television.
Yeah.
And when I first went to the cinema, the first film at the age of 11, I saw Blazing Saddles, and Blazing Saddles was a double A, and you had to be 14 to see a double A, and it was only a double A because it had the word crap in it.
Yeah. And
there's the farting scene. Now, whether or not the farting scene played in any part in the censorship, I don't know, but certainly it was the case that you couldn't have even the mildest swear word exposed to, you know, children under the age of 14 at that time, and nothing on television. You know, like, I mean, even you look back, you see films like Dirty Harry, and Dirty Harry was an X, and it was ever so shocking. They could show Dirty Harry in the afternoon on television now.
Yeah. Huh? Well, when they reclassify films, like The Warriors is one of my favorite films, and it's an 18. It's an 18 certificate. It would easily be a 12A. You know, if it was released in cinema today, it would be a 12A, and you'd have Dad and the three boys all watching it together, ranging from 11 down to 4. You know, with a popcorn, because it's just about bums on seats, isn't it? But I think, do you think there's sort of what's your sort of view on sort of language and content like that within humour?
Oh, I've kind of given up on it now. I mean, I did a show which was recorded in Wales for Go Faster Stripe. It was recorded in Cardiff at the Chapter Arts. And I was talking to you off air about this earlier on. In fact, it was recorded 8 years ago, and it's never been released because I felt it hadn't been a good show. And then I watched it again recently, and it was actually really fine. I couldn't see anything that was wrong with it, really. Anyway, I'm going to tell Chris to put it out at some point. In fact, I think I'm going to put it all together with some other stuff that I've recorded in the years since, and just put it out as one DVD. But it was the show which I did for the Edinburgh Fringe in 2012, was called Simon Donald's School of Swearing. And
I remember this. Yeah, I've seen this.
And it was looking into swearing and what swearing was and how it was used and how it's changed through time. And that's really one of the essential things that I learned in my research for this show, is that language and its use is flexible. Yeah. And it forever changes.
Along with its ability to offend as well.
Yeah. the conclusion that I drew in that show is really the thing that really should be seen as what makes something an offensive word, and it's usually ignored by those in authority, is what was the intent. Did you intend to offend, or did you not, you know? And I remember, bizarrely enough, I mean, this isn't really somebody to pull out for the political correctness aspect of an argument about language, but Jim Davison used to have a routine, in which a policeman had told him that he was going at a certain speed, and he was arrested for telling the policeman to F off, right? Now, his routine was all about the fact, well, no, I didn't mean it that way. When you said 40 mile an hour in a 30 mile an hour zone, I said off, meaning
I can't believe that.
Wasn't that speed.
Yeah.
Right? Now, I gave loads of examples of that sort of thing in the show, right? And it's very rarely the case that when a swear word is used, or a word that's classified as a swear word is used in its original meaning. And it's such a vast and grey area, you know. Like, it's punctuation to some people. There's a routine that I often do when I talk about when I discovered for the first time doing a show in London. The promoter came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, we don't like you using the C word in this club, you know." And I said, "Do you mean sea anemone or sea cucumber?" Well, she meant the sea bomb, right?
Yeah.
Now, I honestly found that really bizarre, because I'd never worked in London before that. And I'd done all of my shows in either the north of England or in Scotland before that. And in Glasgow, that isn't even considered to be a swear word.
Term of endearment.
They complain if you don't use it often enough, you know.
Question your moral standing if you don't.
So it's a strange old game, and like I say, I just think if you don't mean offence, that really should be taken account of, you know. I mean, obviously, you've got certain words have historical meanings. You've got to be very careful of those, you know?
and maybe a non-negotiable level of offence that is attached to certain words, which is completely fine. But we're talking in the broader sort of words that can be used as adjectives and also full stops and commas.
Guttural language.
Language of the people, Simon.
Actually, one of the things that I did in that show was there's a very interesting thing about swearing. That a lot of swear words simply became swear words because of the British class system. Yeah. So there was a word. I mean, this is only a theory. This is one theory of how this word came about. But there's a Russian word, blodgry, which means very. And people who had travelled, this is in the days when only very wealthy people could afford to travel for pleasure. So when people had been to Russia, they would come back to England and they would drop the word blodgry into conversation. And it was to show off that they had travelled. Now, middle-class people who couldn't afford to travel abroad would copy this, and they would start to use the word blodgry. It's blodgry good show. And then working class people copied them. Now, while middle class people began to use the word, it fell out of fashion for the upper class people, because it was now a word that was used by people lesser than themselves. Now, when the middle class people were using it and the working class people began to copy them, the middle class people heard working class people use it, and it fell out of fashion in middle class circles. Now, it's middle class people who are the pen pushers of society, right? They are the people who are trying to prove their worth.
Yeah.
They're the people who invent table manners, and they go on relentlessly about punctuation and grammar and all the rest of it. And they're the people in charge of dictionaries. And they are the people who, when a word is out of fashion with the middle class, only used by the working class, it becomes a working class word, or a word used only by the unwashed classes.
Yeah.
So it becomes a common or dirty word.
Yeah.
So they then classify that as being a word that shouldn't be used. And that ends up then being classified as a swear word. Now, blodgery, you may ask, what's that all about? Well, it corrupted in use of English to be bloody good show.
Yeah, okay.
Show. Now, that's one theory, but there are other instances of that where words just become swear words through fashion and often through snobbery. It's just who uses it that determines whether it's an acceptable word in society.
Steph?
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting. I myself just want to say thank you for chunks of my childhood that were spent looking at that lovely comic. I come from a tiny little village in West Wales, and there was one boy whose parents ran the post office. We used to like and read Viz, and behind his parents' back. We weren't paying for it; we were just going to read it. And the question I have is, I loved characters like Johnny Fat Pants and Buck Gonad and stuff. How did you create these characters?
Well, they all began. Viz was a little bit more random initially. Excuse me. There was an element from the word go of us sort of mimicking the British comics style, especially the style of the comics of DC Thompson from Dundee.
Yeah.
So we began. There was a character in the first edition of Viz who was called Fat Sod, and he basically he stole the pie from the farmer's wife's windowsill, and went and scoffed it, and then the farmer caught him sitting down to eat it, I think, behind a hedge, and came and shot him with a shotgun, and then his wife cooked Fat Sod in a pie, and that was the end of the strip. Very simple stuff, but it hadn't been done before. This was the crux of it, really. And that sort of developed over time. We worked over the first few issues of Viz on inventing I'm not really thinking about it too much, but it somehow happened that we invented this style that was based very much on the comics of DC Thompson, and also IPC, who were, Wizard and Chips and Topper and some of the other titles. And we took this world. I mean, somebody said this in a review once, and we sort of laughed at it, but we realize now that it makes perfect sense. So we took this world, this cozy world of British comics, where, it all exists in adventures in the park and yoinks a tenner and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Now for a feast. So we took this sort of cozy world of British comics, and we injected into it the sort of brutal realities of working class life in Northern England. So that's where the likes of Biffa Bacon came from. So my brother was on a train, or it might have been a bus, and there was a kid. His child was bullying another child. So there was the father and son were working class, and there was like this posher sort of middle class kid on the bus/train, and the kid started bullying the posh kid, and he came back to his dad and said something or other about this kid. Said something to his dad about the posh kid, and the dad said, "Aye, gone on, son, give him one for me." My brother just, Jesus Christ, this is so. So he just thought, like, you know, there's the scenario of reality, and in the Beano and the Dandy, you know, you have this world where bullying takes this entirely sort of whitewashed form of inky pellets and tripping people up and, you know, whatever it was, you know. And so we just kind of put the two together. We didn't think about this consciously at the time. You know, it's like I say, it was pointed out to us years later that was what we had done. As teenagers, we just did it sort of without thinking. It was, we just thought what was funny. And I think, you know, the things that made us laugh, that was the thing that we shared together as the three of us. Jim, who I was saying, who'd introduced us to the idea of comics for grown-ups, and Chris, together they started to work on the first issue of Viz, and then they asked me if I wanted to get involved. And you know, we started off, I mean, the first strip I ever did was about a guy who goes to visit Mr. Kipling, the cake baker. And I mean, I can recite it to you now. It's like a three-page thing, and it says, Mr. Kipling was a jolly nice chap, and he invited me along one Sunday afternoon to sample his new Bonfrit slices. And then in the next frame, it says, he sported some wizard sex aids and was kind enough to let me have a quickie with his wife. Then we sat down to sample his cakes. And he said, unfortunately, I ate so many of his goodies that I bowked rich brown vomit well into the night. Now, I was 15 when I did this, right? And I was editing the audio book of my autobiography the other day, and I heard, the only reason why that's in my head so clearly is because I just edited the audio of it the other day, and I thought, actually, for a 15-year-old, that's quite good, you know.
Yeah.
And
yes,
from there on, we just kind of, I don't know if I maybe sort of beginner's luck. I hit a high early on. I look at the stuff that I did in the following maybe 10 issues or so, and it's not that strong, most of it. But there was this thing developing, concentrating more and more on the style of the British comics. And we had, I think the reason why we made a comic, we probably, in this day and age, if we'd gone into production of Viz now, it probably wouldn't have been a comic. It was just that we could all draw a bit.
Yeah.
And it was a medium that we could put our jokes into. And I think now we would probably be doing a YouTube channel or something like that, and doing sketch comedy, which is, I think, what we all loved. You know, we liked Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. We loved Monty Python. We liked the Stan Freberg show and the Goons. We listened to those on my dad's records when we were kids. So sketch comedy was kind of always what we loved. And of course, inadvertently, that was what Viz represented. You know, sort of a page of Viz is about a 5-minute sketch, really.
Yeah.
So that was, I mean, it came about through various means, but I mean, the characters, Johnny Fartpants, Steffan, was the one that you mentioned there when you were asking about the origins of these characters.
Yeah.
So I'll fill you in on how that one came about, because that's actually quite an unusual one. It happened in a way that I can only ever think of happening once again thereafter, which was the Fat Slags. Now, we actually sat down and asked ourselves as a team, what could we produce that we haven't done yet? And on that occasion, when we sat down to do when we actually came up with Johnny Fartpants, the thing that we were looking for the most typical Viz character, a character that would sum up what Viz was all about. That was the idea. And the reason why we wanted to do that was because we had at the time interest from a national publisher.
Yeah.
And this was IPC magazines, who I mentioned earlier, the Topper and Wizard and Chips and so on. And they at the time were producing about 50% of all the content that was sold to young people in the UK on the shelves of newsagents. Now, they had been struggling for many years to find a magazine that would sell to 16 to 24-year-old men. 16 to 24-year-old men just didn't buy magazines. And they found through a television program that we'd been on. Do you remember this genre called youth television that the BBC used to put out? Now, we used to laugh at it, right? We sort of thought it was a joke. We thought it was so patronizing at the time. But that was, looking back, that was because we were teenagers. And teenagers see everything as being patronizing bullshit, right? So it was actually youth television that gave Viz its national birth, really, because firstly, the community program unit at the BBC did a program called Something Else, and they featured Viz in '81. And then 2 years later, the BBC did another show called Sparks that was all about young people who were doing it for themselves. And we appeared on that. Now, when we appeared on that, it was seen by a guy called Bob Painter from IPC Youth Group, and he came to us desperately trying to sign us up. Now, it was coincidentally also seen, and you got to remember, tell the young people, this was when there was only 3 channels on television.
Well, yeah, 82. We were looking after our 4th channel, wasn't it? So
yeah. So they had this this show that we appeared on. IPC saw it, and they came to us, and they wanted to sign us up to become a national publication, because up to this point we'd been doing it as a hobby and had lost money, but it was selling in significant numbers to young people. This was the young men. This was the thing that they couldn't produce anything. And I mean, Christ, if you ever wanted a message why you can't sell things to young men, the story of what happened with us at that time would tell you everything. So, for instance, when we sent them, what they wanted to do, it was a sort of a 6-month-long job interview, effectively. And we had to produce what's called a dummy issue. So it's not actually going to go to press. It's just, we produce it as if it's going to go to press. We send it to them and they look at it.
Like a sitcom pilot, perhaps.
Exactly, like a pilot, exactly. So we sent them this, and what they did was, as soon as it landed in their laps, they put their team of humor experts onto it. And the first thing they did, and honestly, my brother's got this, he's got the letters that they sent us still, right? The first thing that they noticed was that Sid the Sexist was clearly a chauvinist. Now, the clue was in the words "the sexist," right? So it should have been apparent from the word go that this kind of marriage between Viz and IPC was never going to work, right?
Yeah.
But we were trying our hardest because we thought, well, I mean, to try to sum it up for anyone who doesn't know the history of the north of England at that time, this is the early 1980s. We didn't have jobs. I spent 5 years signing on. I was unemployed for my whole family all signed on at the same box on the same day at Swan House in Newcastle. It was desolate. I mean, it was dreadful times. Now, we would have, got down and sold ourselves for a contract at that time. I can say that now because I don't have to appear to be a
company man or
sticking it to the man.
Yeah.
Or, and I mean, to be honest, they would never have. I mean, the reason why it didn't work anyway, they realized themselves that they couldn't contain us. It wasn't going to work that way. Although I can say now, I would have hoarded myself for them. The truth of the matter is they wouldn't take us on in the end because they knew that we were too wild for them, really.
Yeah.
And we were. I still am, I guess, very much like that. But anyway, to get back to the creation of Johnny Fartpants, which is all relevant to this. So we were trying to create this issue for them, this pilot issue. And we wanted to hit them with something that would sum up what Viz was. So we sat down and we said, what do we need that sums up what Viz is? And the first thing that we all agreed on was it had to be one of these British cartoon characters. So we said, right, typical British cartoon character, has adventures in the park, gets slippered off his mom and dad, wears a hoopy jumper and shorts, all that. And then, but we need a trait. We need a trait that is the comedy trait, like they have in all of those strips. So, Desperate Dan is so strong, breaks everything. Claude Hopper has very big feet. The Bash Street Kids are naughty. Dennis the Menace is naughty. Errol is naughty. So
Minnie and Minx is also naughty.
So we just had to come up with something that real kids do that doesn't happen in comics. Now, once again, like swearing, this has all changed, right? Yeah. Nothing that Johnny Fartpants ever did wouldn't get in the Beano now. Do you know what I mean? It's a strange word. And whether we changed the world, I guess, I don't know. But everything has changed. So we had to come up with something that would never be in the real world of comics, but is in the real world of 11 and 12-year-old boys.
Yeah.
So we created Johnny Fartpants, who was supposed to be a sort of a 12-year-old boy, and he farts, and that's his trait, and we just straight away came up with all of the, that one sounded like a fridge door opening, and all of that, pull me finger, just everything. Get your Sunday dinner out of that one, Vicar. All of the associated with farting, and it just straight away it just seemed like oh yes, that's it, we've got it, let's do it. So we that was how Johnny Fartpants came about, and later stolen by somebody to make a film, but unfortunately we looked into that and couldn't get them in court. But he wants to take me to court, up to him. But yeah, Thunderpants. Oh, coincidence.
Yeah.
Anyway,
He was got some flash lunch issues, but you mentioned sort of like sticking it to the man and sort of being like wild and resisting this sort of creative stifling or creative control from somebody above. Like obviously Viz comes out in the late 70s, and the late 70s is also synonymous with the punk scene and those sort of musical movements in the UK. And like I would describe Viz as sort of it looks like the Dandy, it looks like the Beano, but it's not. It's sort of a punk sort of bastardization of those tropes that people get used to. Did punk music and other sort of music at the time feed into your sort of creative influences then as well?
Very much so. The first place that Viz was sold was at a place called the Gosforth Hotel, which is it's not a big hotel. It's just, it's an old pub on the corner of a high street, and it's downstairs you had the bar and the snug, and then upstairs you had a function room, and the entrance to the function room was via a stairwell, and there was a sort of a side door to the pub that opened directly onto that stairwell. So when bands were playing in the function room, you could get into the stairwell and get straight up the stairs and into the room where the bands were playing without being seen by any staff of the pub. So it was just a thriving hub of underage drinkers, you know. Often, I mean, often a lot of them weren't even drinking, to be fair. You know, they just sneaked in to see the bands. So me and Chris and Jim used to go down there. We started in about the summer of, I don't know if it was early as the summer of 78 or if it was the summer of 79. We used to start going along there every Monday night. Now, the bands that we used to go and see were called Arthur Two Stroke.
Yeah.
And the other band were the Noise Toys. Now, they were sort of part of I guess, I mean, it eventually became a label. It was a sort of promotions agency that was comprised basically of one man called Andy Pop, and his label was Anti-Pop. So, you know, it was like this. I guess it was immediately post-punk when he had started, and it was in the, I guess it was the sort of late waves of punk, really, which was where the name Anti-Pop came from. And the bands who had been in that room immediately before Arthur Two Stroke and the Noise Toys was Last Exit, which was Sting's band.
Right.
So Mr. Sting out of the police used to play in there, and he had then gone to London. And so after that, Anti-Pop set up residency in there on a Monday night. Now, we were going down there as underage drinkers to see the bands. And this was around the time that Chris was doing something that came in between the Lily Crescent Locomotive Times and the Fat Crusader, and which was they produced 2 photocopied sheets. Now, the photocopier had arrived in Newcastle at this time. Now, a sheet of photocopied A4 nowadays will cost you about 5p.
Yeah.
Sheet of A4 photocopy in 1978 cost 10p, and you know that's without taking inflation into account, right? So it was even more expensive in the sheer straightforward monetary terms. And if you take into account that
inflation and
the 50 quid that it cost to print the first issue of Viz would equate to about 3,500 quid now.
Yeah. Well, that's a barrier in itself, isn't it, to getting something out there?
Yeah. So we started to go and see these bands, and Chris and Jim had produced these 2 sheets of photocopies to sell. So it was like taking the Fat Crusader concept, putting it onto a sheet of paper, and then selling it at cost just to spread the laughs amongst their friends, you know. It didn't work because, well, the first one didn't work, should I say, the Daily Pie it was called, and that was because the photocopy was 10 pence. Now, within the next few months, photocopies arrived everywhere, and the price just went straight down. So the next photocopied sheet of cartoons they did was called Arnold the Magazine, and that went out at 2 pence, which was cost to get 2 pence to get a copy. So this showed that there was the opportunity to sell their cartoons. And when going to see the bands, it occurred to Chris that a good tie-in to sell cartoons would be to do like a fanzine that featured the bands.
Yeah.
So it would then, people might not want it for the cartoons,
just piggybacking off the band's sort of popularity.
Exactly, yeah. And so that was how Viz became both a comic and a sort of a magazine, if you will, because all of the articles originally, the spoof articles, featured the local music scene. So it was all written like it was smash hits or
yeah.
NME or,
Yeah.
but piss take style. There was never any serious music coverage. It was all jokey. But then, shortly after that, we introduced the Viz chart and so on, which was the most honest chart in the UK, where basically the higher your chart position was determined purely by how much cash you'd paid us. So your chart position was next to the record label and then how much you'd paid, It was brilliant.
Quite an accurate reflection of the music scene in general. I used to do a sort of part-time job where I was paid to go and buy singles when I was at university. And I'd get paid to go and buy singles university, and then I could do what I want with them then. I'd get paid about 20 pence additionally on top of the cost of the single, which I suppose when you get that insight into the music industry, it starts to speak volumes a little bit. But like in terms of characters, like Steffan mentioned, Johnny Farty Pants, a character you're most closely associated with because he's a character you sort of created and drew in the main is Sid the Sexist. I find Sid the Sexist one of these things in comedy where you can be perhaps mocking of yourself or a satirical send-up of something, but there's that danger of maybe the audience receiving it is not quite getting the right end of the stick. How would you sort of describe Sid the Sexist from your perspective as a character?
Well, Sid the Sexist was, I'll tell you what, to sort of give you an idea of how I came up with the idea.
Yeah.
He was inspired, is probably the right word, by a friend of ours. And this friend was not really like Sid the Sexist. So it wasn't based on him, but it was very much inspired by him. So I'll try and explain what I mean by that. Now, this guy was older than us. He used to come and see the bands at the Gosforth Hotel with us. He just lived around the corner from us, so we used to walk up there with him. And he was the first person that we knew who had a video cassette recorder.
Yeah.
And he used to have a load of Laurel and Hardy films, which me and my brother both adored. So we used to go around there and watch Laurel and Hardy with him and stuff. But the thing was, he was a bit older than us, and he was a mature student at Newcastle University doing a very intellectual course. It was an advanced mathematics degree of some sort. But because he was a mature student, he had to take on part-time work in order to help fund his way through uni. And he worked at the biker bin depot. So in a rough part of the east end of Newcastle, he worked at this at the place basically where all the bin men hung out.
Yeah.
So and he worked on reception there, and he spent a lot of time with bin men, and he developed a sort of a real working class Geordie sense of humor, despite actually being an intellectual. So there was this strange juxtaposition between who he was and the way he behaved, so he would just occasionally, when he came across difficult social situations, he would, in an attempt to amuse people, he would go into this alter ego of this Geordie bin man type.
Like a defense mechanism almost.
He was very shy. I mean, he was really terribly shy around girls. And he came round to see me and Chris one night. So me and Chris used what had been originally our bedroom together at the front of the house. And our elder brother had moved out. So I'd got a bedroom of my own. So there was the big bedroom across the front of the house was half Chris's bedroom and half the Viz office. So we sat in there. We used to do all of the so any discussions that we had about work or any socializing that we did at home always happened in there. So Graham came round one night, and he had some jazz cigarettes, and we used to sit in there and just sort of discuss how we were going to take over the world, just the sort of thing that teenagers do, you know. As I say, he was older than us. I think he was in his mid-20s at least. And we were just sitting there having a drink of tea and having a smoke. And eventually he broached the subject very quietly, and he just said, do you know a girl called Sandy? And I said, name rings a bell, can't put a face to it. He said, oh, yeah, she runs the Arthur Two-Stroke fan club. I said, oh, yeah, Sandy, yeah, I know Sandy. And he said, I was thinking of asking her out. I said, all right, yeah, cool. You know, sort of, okay. And he says, what do you think I should do? And, you know, coming from an older guy.
Yeah. A guy in his mid-20s asking dating advice, a guy in his mid-teens.
Yeah. Who spent his entire life in his bedroom drawing comics, you know? So,
yeah, the Lothario of Jesmond.
Exactly. So he says, what do you think I should do? And I said, ask her out. And he says, nah, I couldn't do that. And I said, right. Well, what did you have in mind? He says, oh, I don't know. I says, why don't you just phone her? Give her a ring on the phone and ask her out. And he says, nah, couldn't do that. I says, what, you couldn't knock on her door now? You couldn't ring her up now? Right? And they were just, you know, talk about something else for a while. And eventually, he produces a little bit of paper from his pocket, right? And he unfolds it, and it's just a tiny little square of paper. And he says, do you think that'll do the trick? So I look at this piece of paper, right? And it says, Dear Sandy, I would like to go to the pictures with you. If you would like to come, please ring me on this number, Graham, right?
Yeah.
Now, this was in mirror writing, right? He'd written it all backwards. Right? Like to impress the girls, you know? And I was thinking, is he serious? I can't tell if he's serious or not. Is he taking the piss, you know? So I sort of tried to hedge my bets, you know. I just said, you know, who knows, you know. Back, you know?
Yeah, stay impartial.
Yeah, so anyway, he brings it up again a bit later on, you know. He says, do you think I should do it then? I says, do what? He says, put that note through a door. And eventually I says, oh, look, man, Graham, you know, if I heard this piece of advice, you know, going around my head that I'd been given once, which was, even if you ask a girl out and she rejects you, she's still going to be flattered, you know? Yeah. I said that to him, you know? And he said, all right. Anyway, just eventually decides he's going to go home, you know? But he might go and pass her door on the way home, you know? Anyway, we went to the front door to see him off. And we're standing there at the front door, and he walks off down the garden path. We had quite a long garden path. And he's about halfway down the path. And this little mousy man who's too afraid to speak to women and who's asking teenagers what to do to ask them, you know, he's just walking down the path all like the sort of, like a civil servant, you know.
Yeah.
He just reaches into his pocket and he turns round, pulls this tiny bit of paper out of his hand, and he waves it in front of me and my brother. And he says, oh, lads, you think this piece of paper's gonna pull me some totty tonight? And that was it. You know, at that point, you know, it's almost like you want to pull out the cliche, the rest is history, but that's really how it happened, you know, because thereafter, you know, the idea of having a mousy man who was too frightened to speak to women, who, if he was honest and spoke to women you know, as himself, he would probably get on quite well with them, but he feels the urge to produce this alter ego that's all about peer pressure and is driven entirely by what he thinks everybody tells him.
Yeah,
he should
a very misjudged, miscalculated sort of veneer of self-defense, really, over the 2 years. And the irony there is that you'd have more success just, excuse the cliche, being yourself. We got a question here, Simon, from someone watching. I read it out as well, so the audio. From Colin Mayhew. Do you think Say the Sexist worked as a TV crossover?
Firstly, Colin, you need to stand a bit closer to your razor in the mornings. Now, did it work with the TV crossover? Well, it didn't. There's a story behind this, which is that Polydor released it as a DVD. Before that, it was released initially as a VHS cassette. Now, it was intended for Channel 4, and it had been Viz had been on TV twice before on Channel 4. Billy the Fish was initially done on Channel 4. Channel 4 had approached us, you know, wanting to put Viz on TV. Now, it seemed obvious to us that I think this is something that we touched on earlier about language on TV at the time. You know, there wasn't really much in Viz that was suitable for television at the time.
And again, that's sort of stifling the creative process then, isn't it? Yeah. It's doing what you're allowed rather than what you want to do.
Exactly. But the one exception that we spotted was Billy the Fish, because Billy the Fish was based on kids' comics. It was based on those boys' comics. It worked as a TV thing because, firstly, it didn't have any foul language in it. Secondly, we envisaged it being, you know, very much like Captain Pugwash. We actually wanted it to be done in the Captain Pugwash style.
Yeah.
But it was done in a more traditional sort of cartoon style in the end. Now, Harry Enfield voiced it all, and it worked really well. Billy the Fish worked really well. Roger Melly was the next one, which was voiced by Peter Cook. And once again, that worked. It wasn't. I don't think it was as perfect for TV as Billy the Fish. Billy the Fish sort of worked because of the way it appeared in the comic and the way it went out on TV were almost the same as one another, or they were so similar in content, and the style worked, you know. So I think Billy the Fish was a big success. Roger Melly was funny. Harry did the rest of the voices. Peter Cook did Roger Melly himself, and I think it worked to an extent. Now, what happened next was we had discussions with them, and the next things that we proposed were Sid the Sexist and the Fat Slags. And the way that worked was my brother and the other two guys who we were working with by this time, Simon Thorpe and Graham Jury, who had come to us by Graham's girlfriend was at university in Newcastle, and he was a cartoonist of, you know, just a doodler. And she put him in touch, and he came to visit. And we basically said to him, could you do anything in the style that we are doing? Could you write stuff for yourself, blah, blah, blah. And he just came on board he fitted in very nicely. And then Simon Thorpe was the only person to answer an advert that my brother put in Private Eye when we eventually got a publishing deal, which, by the way, of course, wasn't with IPC because they dropped us like a hot brick eventually. It was with Virgin at the time. But anyway, if we have time, we may come back to that. But so the advert that my brother put in the paper was in Private Eye. It read National Magazine. No, funny cartoons wanted by National Magazine. Bum rates paid. and then a post office box number. And he was the only person who answered it. And Graham and Simon, they are actually the guys who do Viz now. They run it all now, with a couple of other guys who we worked with for many years. Davy Jones, you will know. David Davy, originally from Wales. Actually, he was born in Newton Aycliffe, but he lived on Anglesey for most of his life before he came to Newcastle. And then Alex Collier, who came to us as a work experience kid.
Yeah.
Jesus, it's very windy out there. So, yeah, where was I? What was the question?
We'll put it back on the screen.
Yeah, I can get back to it. It was
the Sexist worst TV crossover.
Yeah. So we discussed with Channel 4 Sid the Sexist and the Fat Slags. Now, Chris, Graham, and Thorpe were going to do the Fat Slags, and I was going to do Sid the Sexist. So what happened was there was a young guy, and I can't remember his name for the life of me, at Channel 4, and he took over as commissioner at this time. Whether it was commissioner for specific types of work, I don't remember. But he came to see us, and he said that he came very solemn-faced to us, and he produced a list of 27 inappropriate words and phrases that were in these two strips, right?
Yeah.
That were going to be turned into animations. And I said to him at one point, we were trying to sort of walk on eggshells through this. And eventually I just said to him, well, what did you think you were commissioning? When it's called Sid the Sexist and the Fat Slags. I mean, anyway, they eventually decided that they wouldn't go through with the commission of either of them. So they were only released on VHS and like a video nasty, like Driller Killer or something like that. But the thing was, we were in such a position of power at that time because Viz was doing so well that we were able to just walk away from Channel 4. We did, we made the decision at that point. We're not going to go along with what they want. We're not going to drop the stuff. We're going to do it the way we want to do it. And if Channel 4 don't want to have it, we know Polydor will put it out regardless. So that was Polygram, it was, wasn't it? So, but that was what we decided. It was what they did in the end. And the point that I want to make most strongly, Colin, is that when the DVD versions were released, the Roger Melly one was outsold by the Sid the Sexist one by 27-1.
Yeah. So
was it a success in that sense? Yes, definitely. It was more popular on DVD than anything else that we did. But I think that is very much a Newcastle thing. I mean, it is a massive seller around here. And I do like to point that out because my brother, obviously, Roger Melly was his baby. And I do like to point out that I outsold.
It's nice to see that sibling rivalry never dies, Simon. I think that's an important thing to take with you.
And one more point, Colin. There's one place where it goes wrong, where it goes wrong terribly. And I think I might be able to put this right myself and do a director's cut on YouTube. It's only just occurred to me while I'm thinking that I could do this now because I've got the technology to do it, right? Where it goes wrong is in the way it was edited. There's nothing wrong in what was recorded. It was just really badly edited, in particular the sound. So a lot of the timing of jokes is essential. And I think it's very poorly put together in terms of that, but nevertheless, it is very popular. So I can't complain, but I would like. Will I wait some time doing the director's cut? If we were stuck here for another 2 years, I'd probably do that. But maybe I'll take one episode and do it.
Steph, do you want to sort of go on to stand up and wrap up with that to the last 10 minutes?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I do have one question. My good friend Nigel has texted me, and he's a big fan, and his dad was a big fan of his and that kind of stuff as well. And he's always liked your top tips, like don't worry about getting the stain of red wine on your teeth. Just drink equal parts of white wine. Like he was asking, what's your favorite top tip?
Well, but I think probably one of my favorites. And I can't remember who wrote this one. May have been sent in by a reader. It's a popular question about letters and top tips. Is who writes it? Is it actually written by readers? Is it actually written by the editorial team? And the answer is it's about 50-50, or it was when I was working at Viz. When me and Chris had our time at Viz, we oversaw the sort of the beginning of the letters page and the top tips, and it always worked out that sometimes it would be 80-20 one way, sometimes it would be 80-20 the other way, but it always worked out around about 50-50 that half the letters were written by us and half of them were written by readers. Now, that said, they were often edited. The ones that were sent in, there was kind of an idea came in, and it wasn't quite rounded. It didn't quite work, but we did a little bit of work on it, and then it was good enough to go in. But one of my favorites was the guy. There was a Star letter a few years ago. A guy who walks into B&Q, and a man in a black and orange uniform asks him if he wants decking, and he said, "Fortunately enough, I got the first punch in. But I just thought other readers might want to be aware, But there's been, there's been loads. I mean, the one I remember that I was proudest of at the time was when we were first working on. It first occurred to us that we could do the somebody further down the page responding to something that happened earlier on the same page, And I did one that was it was a guy who said, "Pedestrians always save time when crossing roads by only looking in the direction of oncoming traffic." Right, and then it was Mr. H. Smith, Pontefract or whatever. Then further down the page, it was "Pedestrians never try saving time when crossing roads by only looking in the direction of oncoming traffic in case a large blue removals wagon is reversing in the opposite direction," right? And then his address has changed to Leeds Infirmary. I mean, it's not the funniest that's ever been in Viz, but it was just that, that moment of the idea coming to us of responding and changing, maybe let's say becoming a conversation. That was a load of fun. Yeah.
Thank you so much for talking so much about Viz. Thank you for making the time to talk about all stuff. I mean, it's been a lot of our childhoods and stuff. My friend even had the computer game. But you're not just about Viz, you're a stand-up comedian as well, haven't you? You've been going for 15 years now, is it?
Yeah, that's right.
Very impressive.
Yeah, it's
mad. So
the first time I took to the stage was in 2004 at the Edinburgh Fringe. Me and Alex Collier, who I mentioned earlier, the guy who came to Viz on work experience, who now is he writes for a lot of big TV children's shows now. He writes episodes of Mr. Bean and Danger Mouse, a lot of other stuff that I'm just not in with. But so me and Alex, we did a two-man show, which was basically sort of autobiographical. I came on and did 15 minutes talking about the origin of Viz. He came on and did 15 minutes talking about how he came to work for Viz. And then the second half of the show, the last half hour, was basically we just told all of the funniest anecdotes from working at Viz. And then a few months later, he decided to do a stand-up open spot. He said to me before he went and did it, would I object if he told one of my anecdotes in his stand-up routine? And I thought, I haven't got any anecdotes. What's he talking about? I wasn't aware that this was something that I did, And it was just this story about, I had a dog, and it was a lurcher, and it was a rescue dog. And I took it for a walk one night, and I wasn't able to take it for walks when other dogs were around. I couldn't let it off the leash because it was mad. It used to chase these other dogs everywhere, So I used to always take it out just after midnight, just before I went to bed, and it would get it down the field, and it would run figures of 8 like any greyhound will. And I took it down the field one night, and I let it off, and instead of going off and doing its normal circuits of the park, it went off into some trees over at the side. And I followed the dog in, and I was calling its name, and it wouldn't come back. And eventually, as my eyes got used to the darkness, I realized there he was in the distance, and he had his head buried down in, I thought it was like a bag of rubbish or something, he's found something but fortunately enough, he had a wire greyhound muzzle on to stop him from off the. So anyway, when I got a bit closer, I realized it wasn't a pile of rubbish. It was a person, right? And the closer I got, the more I became aware of what it was. It was a naked person, right? And I saw the headlines in the newspaper the next day, dog walker finds murdered person. Yeah. And then I got a bit closer. I realized it wasn't one person, it was 2. And they were, and the woman was on top of the fella, and my dog had got his muzzle buried in the woman's arse, right? with the muzzle on, And right, and this was the point at which I regretted giving my name a dog, giving my dog a name that is normally associated with like moments of extreme joy and victory. So, bingo! All these people, right? So Alex asked if he could tell that story in his stand-up, and at that point, I thought, shit, if he can do that, why can't I?
Yeah.
So straight away, I booked myself an open spot, and I've never looked back, to be honest. I really didn't know what I was doing at first, but I don't think anybody does when they get an open spot. There's not really any way of feeling your way into it other than by just getting up there and trying it, And ironically, I've done this sort of thing where I went into telling stories in which I did the voices of characters, and then I went into going on stage as a character comic. And now I've gone back to, nowadays I do both, but mostly I'm back to what I wanted to do in the first place, which is, just telling stories and jokes, but splitting into characters here and there, which is sort of more flexible, And then I took to doing songs as well, which I said I would never do, but I actually found that I was sort of quite, I just had an ability for doing it. And I thought, well, as long as I can do either songs that I hate, so I'm not going to be ruining a good song for myself, So that's mainly what I'd sort of take children's songs mainly, so songs that my kids listen to that irritate the hell out of them. And then I put sort of adult lyrics to them.
But we've got like, so you said obviously you've taken a stand-up sort of perhaps in your stride, and it is a lot of, I find with stand-up is a strict level of sort of maybe don'ts, but then there's quite a broad, almost sort of infinite number of do's, and there's different ways of doing it. Is there any sort of advice you'd give to anyone watching who might be interested in illustration and cartoons or even stand-up, about sort of getting into that sort of creative sort of avenues and performance?
Well, one of the things that I think is most helpful and most unhelpful at times is the fact that there aren't any rules.
Yeah.
You know what I mean by that? Because the one thing that I compare this to, Paul Weller was interviewed, and he talked about when he got into music, and he said that for him, when he heard the Small Faces, he started listening to them, and he thought, right, this is what I want to do. I want to try and do something like this. So he found his niche, and he didn't want to go too far outside of that. So he wanted to begin making his own music by deliberately trying to copy the style of somebody that he admired. Yeah. And although that sounds very much like plagiarism, nobody ever started out in any artistic world without being influenced by somebody else. And that was the way with me with comic art as well. I once wrote to the editor of one of the American comics that had British editions in the 1970s, and I asked, how do you get into this? And they responded on the letters page of the comic, and they said, I wish I still had a copy of it, and it said, copy your favorite artist, don't be afraid to just do copies of their illustrations, and because no matter what happens, you will always develop your own style. That's in you. It's like handwriting or the way you think, it's unique to each of us. So if you begin by copying somebody, or at least copying parts of somebody or something that you admire, it gives you a little channel into which you can experiment. You can experiment within that sort of little niche, and then later on, if you choose to, you can go anywhere you want with it. And I following the analogy, Paul Weller's probably a good example of that. He didn't stick with just playing like the Small Faces. He did house albums, and he's had all sorts of types of musical influences in the stuff he's released over the years. And I think it goes the same with comedy, the same with illustration. You will naturally find your own way, and I think at first you just need something to occupy your hands or your time to just get you in to feel exactly what that is.
With the sort of situation we're in now, it seems as if there are some sort of light at the end of the tunnel, and whether we'll go back to a normality we used to of performing in live performance. But all of that aside, what's next for you now, Simon? What's coming up in the near and sort of more distant future?
Well, I've started to work on a little bit more, just because I've had time. I've started to work on putting stuff up on my YouTube channel more. So I've put up a whole series of shows from 2004, show that I made with Alex Collier, the guy I was talking about you with earlier, the guy who came to visit on job experience. We did a show in the Northeast with Time Tees called The Regionaires, and it was a show based entirely in the Northeast. The idea was we were trying to make a show about the Northeast of England for the Northeast of England, specifically to try and compete with the sort of huge influx of satellite and cable channels that have come along, the content of which really wasn't. I mean, it was all just like the more TV channels there are, the more stuff gets watered down. And we thought, that you've got Time Tees and all of the other regional stations around the ITV network, all of whom have a specific area into which they're broadcasting. Why can't they do entertainment that is specifically for that area? You know how comedians have material that they cannot do outside of their own area because people won't understand the references,
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that isn't valuable entertainment. So we did this show where we got, there was always a comic on, there was always interesting people who were famous in the region for one reason or another. And we did this panel comedy show. And anyway, it lasted just the one series. They didn't recommission it. They sold the studio off, and it was a tragic day really for regional TV, because we were getting tremendous viewing figures, and they just they didn't want it anymore because they were going with the idea that everybody had to make stuff that could be broadcast nationally from the ITV stations, which as far as we were concerned was the wrong direction to go. Anyway, we made this show. It was a great success where it was supposed to be a success, and then it was recommissioned. So anyway, I happen to have a copy of it on DVD, so I've put that all on my YouTube channel. And I'm going to be putting up some other stuff from the past. I mean, you asked me to talk about the future, but I happen to be putting up some stuff from the past. I'm going to put up some old Viz appearances on TV, those early TV appearances. I'm going to put those up on my YouTube channel. And then the other stuff that I'm doing is I'm editing together an acting show reel, because another thing that we haven't touched on. I trod the balls as a boy, so I've been meaning to put an acting show reel together for ages, and I recorded one, and then I've just never had the chance to put the footage together. So that'll be going on my YouTube channel. But the big thing that I'm doing sort of comedy wise at the minute is a show that I do monthly at the stand in Newcastle with my brother Chris. So it's the first time that we've worked together in 20 years, and we do a show called Donald Trumps. So it's the Donald brothers trying to out-Trump each other. It's a show that's sibling rivalry. It's entirely unscripted once we get there. But before we get there, me and him I put together all of his questions. He puts together all of my questions, and we have no idea what they are. It's fielded by Alfie Joey. He works as the compere and referee and scorekeeper, and he has no idea what he's going to be reading out to each of us on the night. So that's great fun. We do that every month. Obviously, haven't been able to.
Yeah, but when the next one will be, we don't know. But fingers crossed, it's not going to be too long.
And I'm also editing. I mentioned earlier that I was going to try and get the 2012 show finally released with Go Faster Stripe, and I've got a load of other stuff that I've recorded on video since that I want to put together as a package and release that as a DVD. Yeah. And then God knows when, but I'll be back on the comedy circuit just doing new stuff. I've been doing some new gags. I did a piece for the Chippenham Comedy Festival, which is now, I've released that free now that it's past its sell by date. They were trying to raise money for the venue where the festival normally takes place. But now that fundraising event's over, it's available on my YouTube channel. I've got some new gear in there, and I'm just working on further new stuff for whenever the comedy circuit gets going again.
Yeah, so hit the ground running, as it is. I think it's going to be a bit of a mad rush. I think because everyone's diary is going to be very empty, unfortunately. But this has been an absolute pleasure. We really appreciate you giving up your time on a wet and windy Sunday afternoon in the northeast. Thank you to everyone who's been watching and listening. Thank you to Joe Pitt as well, who helped us provide the platform. Check out Simon's YouTube channel, and Simon, hopefully we can build together sometime soon in the not so near future, and we come out of this other side.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. It's been lovely to speak to you, Steffan. You too, Drew.
Cheers, Simon.
Thank you very much. Thank you for my child.